Buongiorno and welcome to the Author's Preface, a show that looks at how authors and their stories are forged. I'm your host, Sam Hale. Thanks for coming back. So what's good with me? Got some goodies for the show between podcast interviews. So I've been calling these tap outs. So far I've got two out. Literary Grubhub, which looks at the pernicious effect hustle culture has had on traditional and self-publishing, as well as the most recent one, which is the Tortured Artist Trap. And that one is pretty much on the tin, just looking at how suffering, when induced, auto suffering maybe, isn't actually all that productive and gets in the way of truly great art and productivity. So check those out if you're interested. These are just little asides. I don't think they go past, 16, 17 minutes, which for me, that's short-winded, believe it or not. But it's a nice little way to exercise some of my thoughts on the business, the art, and all that good stuff. So if you're interested, those are both up, Literary Grubhub and The Tortured Artist Trap. So who am I talking to today? Today's guest is historical fiction / fantasy author Judith Starkston. Notable works include the now 4-book series in the Tesha series. The latest book just dropped. That one is called Flights of Treason. That is dropped as of the release of this pod. So if you're a fan of historical fiction and fantasy, I would recommend looking at Judith's portrayal of the ancient world with a magical twist. In prep for the pod, I had the pleasure of reading Hand of Fire. It's a novel that takes place during the Trojan War, focusing on the completely underplayed heroine Briseis. Really interesting conversation about her in the show. Hope you'll enjoy that. I know I did. Accolades, all the good stuff. Judith is the recipient of the San Diego State University Conference Choice Award for her book Priestess of Ishana, as well as a semi-finalist for the M.M. Bennett's Award for Historical Fiction for her novel Hand of Fire. What do we talk about today? We dive right into it. We're talking about Antiquity, taking place largely in the Eastern Mediterranean basin, Asia Minor, the Levant, and discussing things such as who were the Trojans. A lot of people know about the Trojan War, they know about Troy, and some of the most pivotal characters such as Hector and Achilles. But looking at people such as Briseis, as well as the language group, the geopolitical landscape of these people we call the Trojans, and what was the space they occupied in that landscape. So that was really cool. And then going even deeper into the interest Judith has in antiquity, again, focusing largely in the Mediterranean, but looking at an amazing queen named Puduhepa, who, from the research I did before we did the show, as well as what I learned during, just a fascinating woman, and not enough great ladies like herself getting the attention they deserve. So it's really cool to see Judith focus on her for her 4-book series, the Tesha series, as well as things like verisimilitude. She and I are both writing historical fiction. The question of what do you get away with, or what can you get away with within the genre? And it's an interesting conversation, one I've had before with guests such as Karen Oden, about verisimilitude, believability. We're already writing something, in the case of Antiquity, in a language that didn't exist, even in a nascent way. So what do we get away with? And what breaks through the fourth wall as far as the reader is concerned? That was an interesting conversation, one I had a lot of fun discussing with Judith. Just the whole conversation. This was a treat for me. I've been looking forward to having someone as knowledgeable as Judith on the history of the Mediterranean and antiquity. There's a ton of good stuff in the pod. If you'd like to learn more about Judith for her socials and all that good stuff, you can go to her website, judithstarkston.com, and she's on the Facebook at judy.starkston, Twitter, whatever we're calling it now, Judith Starkston, and then Instagram, Judith_Starkston. I'm excited to bring this one to you. I've been waiting to have this kind of conversation, not just on the show, but in general. It was a real opportunity to nerd out. Like myself, Judith is interested not only in entertaining people, as well as expressing ourselves, but educating. And I certainly learned something, not just from reading Judith's work, but from this conversation. Hope you enjoyed as much as I did. So without further delay, I bring you Judith Starkston's preface. All right, and I'm here with Judith Starkston. Judith, how you doing today?
I'm great, thank you.
Excellent. Good to hear. So, I want to front load the pod, not only for you, but for listeners. First historical fiction author on the show. Lots of questions coming your way. I would apologize, but I mean, I almost think like this pod is just for me. There's one for you, the audience, there's one for me. This is going to be me. I'm really excited talking with you in back channels too, just even discussing things like the Sea People and the Hittites and so forth. I'm giddy. I'm giddy here. But first, why don't you give folks who missed it at the top the Cliff Notes version of who you are, publications, education, anything you think is relevant?
Okay, I'm write historical fiction because I started out my career as a classicist, so mostly a Hellenist, but Greek and Latin both, and taught for many, many years. And when I stopped teaching, I ended up deciding I'd write a book based in the Iliad, and I have written now. I'm working on my sixth book, if you count a novella, and they're all with women at the fore and all set in the ancient world of Greeks and Hittites. And so I actually ended up putting all those graduate and undergraduate degrees in classics to use. So it's nice.
Not many liberal arts majors can say the same.
No.
That's why I had to get a master's. Yeah. So this is all great. I want to talk about some of those women. One in particular, I don't want to jump the shark here. We're going to get to all that, but first, let's jump into your preface. The old world, I just realized how topical that is considering the material you and I both write about. So, it's already started. I can't wait. Prior to writing, Judith, were you fulfilled in life? Did you feel like anything was missing creatively speaking? Tell us about your old world.
Well, I actually did not start out. I mean, I think a lot of writers have always thought they were going to be a writer, and I didn't. I became a classicist quite by accident, actually. I started out college at the ripe old age of 17 or something. I was young. I had skipped a few grades in school, and I thought I'd be a dancer. Don't ask me why. I cannot actually. That was a really bad career choice for me. But, I heard a professor right at the beginning of, like, an orientation say, "Oh, I always wished he wished he had taken ancient Greek," and I thought, "Oh, okay," the way you do when you're just, like, clueless and young, and I took ancient Greek, and it was great fun, and I loved it, and that was actually, like, if I look at the booky kid that I had been all the way up to then, made perfect sense. Don't know. I admired this young woman who was a teacher at my high school who was a dancer. So I think that's where that notion came from. But anyway, so I taught Greek, but mostly Latin and humanities and English and all kinds of things for many years, and juggled that with raising two wonderful children and had a perfectly happy life. And then I retired somewhat early for a whole host of reasons. Mostly, I was just really tired of grading student essays, which is mind-bogglingly exhausting to the brain. And unfortunately, I was teaching in Arizona, where the schools are very underfunded.
Mhm.
And so, we started out when I started my career at like 20 students, and by the end, there were like 45, 5 classes a day of that. That's a lot of essays. So, it was time to retire. And I did lots of things that I enjoyed when I first retired. I decided I'd take on Hebrew because it was yet another ancient language and fun and things like that. But I did end up deciding that writing was what I wanted to do.
So, in Hand of Fire, you chose to write about Briseis. And I thought that was such an interesting choice because she is such an interesting addition to the Iliad and Homer's poem that every time she shows up, I've read the Iliad only twice now, and you watched the film adaptation from 2004, which is hilariously inaccurate, but great at the
Yes.
same time. It's really got
Yeah.
that sword and sandal vibe to it, but it still works. And I thought it was such an interesting addition to the story. And you more or less had the same question. Why Briseis? So why was it you decided to write a story that focuses so heavily on this character who, as far as time on screen, quote unquote, goes, is hardly in the Iliad?
Yeah, she has practically no lines. And the one clue that we get about her, I mean, she triggers the whole plot arc of the poem by being the property that gets fought over, but that doesn't mean she gets to say much. The one expression of her will that we seem to have is Homer says when Agamemnon's heralds come to get her, and take her away, and drag her off away from Achilles, and take her to the abomination that is the head of the Greek forces, Agamemnon. She goes all unwilling, and that's a pretty good translation of the Greek, you know.
Hmm.
And I thought to myself, well, this is a little peculiar because let's see. She's leaving Achilles, who killed her husband, killed her brothers, turned her from a princess, queen in, to be, into a slave, captive slave. Like, I'm just not getting why leaving Achilles would be something that she was all unwilling to do. And I always approach ancient literature, or any literature, but particularly ancient literature, as like, let's just accept that it's my brain that's not firing at all if I don't understand something. And I just need to keep thinking about this, and then it will make sense. So Homer had to be right. She must have been all unwilling, and let's take that as the premise and come up with an answer to who she is and who Achilles is, because that's the really key part. So often Achilles is portrayed as this, like, the self-centered, I'm all about glory kind of steroid driven warrior. And I don't see him that way at all. And I have to say that a lot of my friends who've read my books now, it's been out, it came out in 2014, say, I had to completely rethink Achilles based on you. And you're right, so I think I'm really true to Homer, and I have a much more emotionally nuanced Achilles. But I had to find a lot of common things in them. And eventually I did. So I answered that question, and that's why I wrote this book. Now there are several other Briseis books out after me, and they all have very different approaches, and I like them all. Like, there a lot of really, that's the wonderful thing about the mythic and the oral poetry tradition, is that it's open to lots of different ways of seeing it and interpreting it, and doesn't mean that one is better and one is worse.
Thought to have not existed for a period of time, quite a long time. Many people thinking Homer's epic was maybe an early work of fantasy, if you consider it one. It has historical characters potentially, but the gods are intervening directly, such as Apollo. People hundreds of years after that looking for it, and then thousands after the fact still looking. In the 1860s, I believe Schliemann is a German amateur archaeologist, claims to have found it in northwestern Turkey with the help of, I believe is an English archaeologist, claims to have found Troy. And the fascination reignites. It's in the papers. There is a photo of his wife. It still drives me insane, wearing,
All this
oh
gold.
my God.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about the historical context of finding any artifact in situ and the importance of that. Regardless, there's the fervor. It's returned. People want to believe. I want to believe Troy's a real place. And then that hype dies down and the skepticism replaces it. But then we do come to find out that based on what Homer is saying, based on the archaeological record, because there's something like 10 to 11, I believe, like striation layers to it,
Yeah.
this really is Troy. And whether or not the Trojan War occurred is something that people still debate. And I don't know where that debate is landed, if there will ever be any kind of consensus. Such is the nature of antiquity. But here we are again. There are films. There will always be, I suspect, as long as people are creating and they give it space, films about Troy, reinterpretations of the Trojan War, or different viewpoints, such as your own, such as the Song of Achilles, which was a wonderful read as well. Why do we have this enduring fascination with Troy? What is it about a beat up old city that nobody should really care all that much about? What is it about it that just persists in the cultural psyche?
It is amazingly resilient. And I think part of it is that, unlike a lot of war pieces. This one, it exists on two levels. So there's that glorification of the heroic battle, like the sort of the effectiveness of one warrior over another and all of that as something that's worthy of celebration, which is a little grim. I mean, for example, when a hero dies, he'll be compared to a flower being cut down in a field or something. It's so gorgeous. It's so beautifully done and so humane, so full of humanity that I think it cuts the kind of the glory of war. Anybody who's been to war knows it's not really glorious. It's really a flower cut down too soon. And so I think Homer is so subtle about that it allows us to feel like he's not saying, catch 22, where the whole premise of war is just hilariously undercut. So there's that sense of it's not all done in vain, that the loss, like, all those people who died in World War I or died, we aren't denigrating the effort, the human cost of war. I think that's really valuable. Unfortunately, there are wars that have to be, fought right now in this moment. When we hear like the Ukrainians made fun of by the Russians, you just know that's one of those moments where there's a deed that has to be done and it's going to cost lives. So, all right, so there's that. But then much more broadly, there's this whole look at the cost of it and at the human dynamic. So the women that are involved, which is part of what brought me to Briseis, the way her life is stripped of all of its potential and then she rebuilds it all on her own. So I was really interested in the resilience of women within the context of war. And so how does an ancient male-oriented, oral tradition have such resonance about women and about their role in this, even though they have very few lines? So there's just a depth to the Homeric tradition that I think keeps it going. It just never gets dated.
All right, so we're at inspiration now. Books or authors, whether they're alive, they've been dead for a few decades, or in some cases millennia. Books, authors, pivotal events, teachers. What kinds of inspiration have you had in your life, Judith, that brought you to the point where you started writing about history?
Well, I loved the Iliad, having taught it for a few decades in English and in Greek. So I had this original book that got driven by wondering what was going on with Briseis, and that inspired me to start learning how to write, which was not easy. Writing fiction is very different from all the other kind of writing that I had done. And in the process, so I wrote the Troy book, and then in the process, I asked what should be to me seemed like a really obvious question: who were the Trojans? Who were these people? And the answer, like you look at Emily Vermeule and all of these great scholars of the Homeric world, and they basically were saying, I mean, frankly, it sounded sort of like, like Star Trek, where they had the universal translator. Oh, well, they spoke sort of Greeky stuff, like, huh?
Yeah.
Well, that's actually not a totally inaccurate answer, but they didn't in originally the culture of the Trojans was something none of us really knew about. It's slightly to the east of the western coast of Turkey was this whole empire that stretched across Anatolia and into Syria, down into Lebanon, and a little ways it bumped up against the Egyptians somewhere in what's now Israel. And that empire got completely obliterated from history. So people always go, when I say, oh, I write about Hittites, because eventually this is where I'm going, they say, oh, you mean those ones in the Bible? And I go, no, 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 no. Those are what we now call Neo-Hittites. And I used to jokingly say, well, it would be like if Pine Top, which is this little town in Arizona, is the only part of the United States remaining, and they call themselves the United States of America pine top,
Hmm.
like, and all the artwork there is hyper American. They have apple pies everywhere and little flags everywhere. And they're all about the iconography of the USA, but really they're this tiny little town. And around them is, empty countryside where the population doesn't think of themselves as Hittite or anything else. They're just like messing around. So the Hittites just got forgotten, the actual Hittite Empire. And it turned out that Trojans are actually part of this Hittite world. Culturally, they are very closely aligned to it. They're a little on the edge of it politically. So sometimes Troy was actually in formal treaty with the Hittite Empire's capital, which is about like a 45-minute drive from Ankara, north and east of Ankara. And sometimes they were, in violent breaking from the Hittites. And by the time the Trojan War years that we sort of traditionally think of, and there was probably several Trojan Wars, it's probably what we think of as the Trojan War. We have evidence of lots of conflicts, and it's probably an amalgam of all of them together.
Hmm.
And the Mycenaean Greeks had towns on that western coast, and so there was interaction and trade and all of that, but and it's probably a history of those troubles. So I said, okay, Hittites. I should have with my graduate degrees from Cornell and etc. I should have known about all these people, but no one was teaching them at that time. Like, it was just no one ever mentioned it. And actually, the several people that I asked this question, who are the Trojans, had really lame answers. Like, no one was in the standard classics academic world saying, oh, well, they're part of the Hittite world. Now people are. But that was when I started out, there was just nothing. It was crickets. And I was reading raw archaeological dig material and trying to piece together what the material culture and the world of this and what's the language of it. It turns out Hittite, which is not what they called their language, is linguistically related to Greek. So it's an Indo-European language. It's probably an early offshoot. And what that meant is that once it gets written and preserved on all these clay tablets with cuneiform. So I always joke that it looks like birds walking around on clay. Completely not Greek, like, does not look like Greek at all. Once somebody takes I don't know cuneiform, I remember one of my best friends in grad school studying it, and I thought, "Oh, that's crazy, I'll never want that," but I was wrong. Boy, do I wish I had studied my cuneiform back in grad school, but I didn't. But once it's taken out of that and put into an alphabet, there's this whole transliteration thing that they do, and it's got like sumerograms. It's like this complicated translation project that happens. It creates a bazillion troubles, as you can imagine,
Hmm.
so that every text is problematic, but we get lots of information from them. But it's really a form of Greek. So, like, when they discuss, well, I'm translating it this way as opposed to that way, I can access all of that discussion because the grammar of it makes sense to me.
And is that because I know there are differences? There's like linear A, linear B, ancient Greek. What are we using to kind of create these correlations?
Linear A is not really translated. We don't exact it's they're making progress on that. I haven't read recently where that is, but that's actually making some progress.
Hmm.
Linear B is a writing system that represents Mycenaean Greek. So yes, that's the Greek that would be most parallel to Hittite,
Hmm.
Luwian, Hittite. They're a whole grouping of languages that are related all across Anatolia. And I did not make an effort to really learn Hittite, but I just have enough background that in these early days before everything there's much more accessibility now. I mean, a layman could learn a lot about Hittites and be just fine. If you're an intelligent reader of history, you'd be fine, but not when I started. I remember after months and months of working on all this stuff, I was visiting my daughter who was going to college in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there's the Sackler Museum there. And I went into the Sackler, and they have a really nice small collection of Hittite artifacts there. And I snuck behind the exhibits into the offices that are there. You're not really supposed to. I mean, it wasn't like I was setting off alarms or anything. And I wandered around and I found there was this wonderful woman who was the curator of the museum. Her door was open. And I said, "Can I bug you?" And, we're sort of women slightly of a similar age and context. I was a friendly face, And I said, "This project, I'm trying to build the world of Briseis," because at that point I was in my Trojan novel. And I'm doing all this work with the Hittite material, and I've built this material cultural construct, and I need to know if I'm even close.
Hmm.
And she went, "Oh, sure, that sounds great." We struck up a friendship, had lots of conversations. I came back and visited her multiple times, and she was like, "Oh, yes." And things like, would Briseis be literate? Like, could she
Mm.
read and write? And yes, absolutely. She would very likely have been, I made her a particular kind of priestess, and that would, we don't think of we I think we think of history as going with things like women's rights and all, we're always progressing. Well, no, we're not. Like Hittite women were so much more empowered as women than a Victorian woman or a 1960s American woman. They had legal rights that those women didn't have. They had access to the highest education. I mean, it's not like they had universities, but so that was really fun. So I learned a lot about Hittites. And in the process, I met this queen, Puduhepa, who ruled. She enters the Hittite written record at probably around age 15, marries, and eventually she becomes a sort of low level vassal queen and then a higher queen. She has this whole cycle of process, and her final written record that we have, she must be in her late 80s, which is weird, weird, weird. And so I just wanted to write about her. Like, I'm sorry, I started out thinking it would be historical mysteries and she'd solve them, because she has this very legalistic. We have some of her judicial decrees, and she's brilliant. And I just thought, "Oh, you're a perfect sleuth." I ended up writing it as epic fantasy because that just included much more of her world than I could otherwise do.
Yeah, and I was reading an article you wrote. I think it was a kind of a guest article on another site, and you mention in it that there are coins minted not just with her husband's face, but hers on the other side, and there was a designated kind of signet for the both of them, but that they chose to have on either side of the coin that, as well as this in of itself was unique for women of that time period.
Yeah,
But
they're not coins because 'cause we're way before money.
mm,
They're her seals. It's the
okay,
signatures that would be pressed into the clay. Yes, and she has her own independent seal on the first extant peace treaty, which was between Ramses II and the Hittite Empire, and it was a treaty that she had largely negotiated. A lot of the input into it, we have letters back and forth. This was, later in her career, after the period that my novel series covers. And she actually has her own independent seal on it. Could have been the co-seal with her husband. He was the great king. She was just the great queen. But even when the great king dies, the great queen continues, like independent of that. Another great king has to be appointed, but by heir. But so there's a lot of power to these women. And yes, she had her own seal.
I thought that was fascinating, and she's corresponding with, say, Egyptian queens, and those are purely, just polite correspondence. But
Right.
then from her, we have actual, more or less, decrees. She is stating this is how things are. This is the order of the Hittite kingdom, and so forth. Which, in of itself, again, is just extremely unique for any woman of the day, whether royalty or otherwise, to actually be mandating things. Again, most of these correspondence are, I hope you're well, our kingdom wishes you the best, may the gods smile upon you, and da 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 da.
Yeah.
But this is, I think she would have been great friends with Queen Dido. It's fascinating to read this sort of
Yeah.
stuff. So, one thing I've got to get to, because This is a question I like to ask when I'm talking with any admirer of history, regardless of when that is. Why should people know history, regardless of what they study, whether it's disco in the 70s or it's looking at the Hittites, if it's going right back to, the Neolithic Revolution sort of stuff, prehistory. Why is it important for people to study history?
We always have, as human beings, we have a really hard time understanding each other. I cannot imagine that any human being will get enough access to enough variety of situations within the course of their own life that they would stop being the idiot that we all started out life being.
Yeah.
Like, we're just not very good at deciphering the larger humane thing to do in any given situation is rising above the limitations of the human body, etc., the drives that we have. And I think history, I would say reading fiction of any kind or reading, just immersion in the human endeavor is good. It doesn't really matter, as you say. I used to defend, because I taught Latin, I had to make these arguments with administrators and all why it had to be Latin that was the best language to study. But to be perfectly honest, well, it might get someone into law school or something. I didn't think that one language had any profound claim over another as valuable. But I thought more the merrier, like get those kids immersed in as many languages as possible in a genuine, deep way, not just, my name is, this is the color green or whatever. So I think anything that immerses people in the stream of humanity in a genuine way, which is, I suppose, the real defense of historical fiction, because my early research into the Hittites, as I say, was looking at site reports from archaeological digs.
Mhm.
And, there's 1 centimeter of mud here and then 1 centimeter of some kind of other material. It's really boring. I mean, it's just profoundly boring and hard to get through. And then you have to interpret it and put it. And the I have lots and lots of really good friends who are in charge of these various archaeological sites that I use in my writing, that I have based my fiction in. And they love what I do, because what I do is take all this raw data and construct it into a world and then immerse readers in it. And it comes alive, and that's, to me, that's fun. I mean, that's what I love to do. And the more little bits of material culture that I have in front of me to build that out of, the better. But you cannot entertain yourself on archaeological reports. So good for fiction.
And I've done one or two surveys. My bachelor at least is in anthropology, so I got to look at the four schools in the American school tradition of anthropology at least. And so I did some surveys. It was exceptionally boring. It was beautiful outside, but my
Yes.
God, it was mind
Walking
numbing.
along looking for a pot shirt or
The
an arrowhead
sherds,
or whatever.
show me the
Ah!
sherds.
Yes.
And I'm close to say like the Navajo reservation, so we're looking for a lot of sherds and arrowheads. Exactly. We both write historical fiction. We both write a unique, maybe in a sub-discipline of historical fiction, in that we both write historical fantasy. And I've thought about this. It sounds like an oxymoron. It's like fried ice cream kind of thing.
Yeah.
But what makes, obviously, I'm biased. What makes historical fantasy so much fun to write? We talked about the virtues of knowing history, one of them being education. I don't care what it takes, but get books in the hands of children.
Yeah.
Read to them every night if you can, that sort of stuff. What is it about historical fantasy that's so enthralling?
Well, I mean, there are, of course, the bad writers of fantasy who use sorcery or magic or whatever to solve problems when they've written themselves into a corner, or they just,
The Deus Ex
that's
Machina.
bad. Yes, we will just say, we will publicly announce that that is not what we mean by fantasy. For me, and I did not start out thinking that I would write fantasy, but then the book, my Troy book, of course, Achilles' mother walks out of the sea. She's a goddess. And I just thought, well, that's what the Greeks thought happened. So that's not fantasy. That's historical accuracy. And I defended that ferociously, well, all through the original marketing of that book, and insisted that I was, and there are a lot of historical fiction readers and writers who love that and are totally comfortable with fantasy. And then there are the diehards. No, 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 no. You are to be banished from the sacred halls of historical fiction. Um, and I just thought they were kind of, okay, that's your view. That's fine. But I didn't agree. But then when I started writing about this Queen Puruhepa, who, by the way, I renamed Tesha in my fiction, because my agent early in the process of getting this manuscript, it went through several forms and under his tutelage, said he would never take a book to market with a woman named Puruhepa. It just sounds sort of awful. But the word Tesha, which is like a lovely sounding name, great, short, it's easy, it's really straightforward. It's the word dream in Hittite. And she was famous in the ancient world, across the ancient world. She was famous for these visionary dreams she had that were guided by the goddess that she viewed as her patron goddess. And she really structured her life on the advice that she got from these visions. So this was a very, very connected into the gods. All right. If that's not fantasy, then there's a lot of history since the Hittites that's got it wrong. Um, but in any case, so there was that piece. But also, she was a priestess as a result of this inspiration that she'd gotten from the time she was a child. Her father was the sort of leader of the temple in the southern part of the empire to Ishtar, which is not the same Ishtar as this is sort of a Hittite version of the goddess of love and war. There's similarities. It's the same goddess, but it's shifted.
I struggle with this. I'm writing about a goddess Tanit who has similarities with Astarte, Melkart Heracles,
Yeah.
all kinds of stuff. So this is the fun and nightmare of writing
And
about
you
the
have to
gods.
just sort of simplify. There's a lot
Yes.
of I mean, the Hittites have their pantheon is the pantheon of 1,000 gods. And that's an number. Like that's a loose number that actually is way more because they're all very localized and it's like, no, we cannot do that. We're not even coming close. And I'm not even going to present a pantheon because it's just not going to work. I borrowed from their sense of themselves, which is they had these very important gods to each leader or to each person, and I just featured discussion of those, and there are others in the temple, like oh, right. So she's a priestess, and she did all these rites, and we have them because we have all these clay tablets that are now translated. And the longer I wrote about this woman, the more translations got done.
Oh.
There's hundreds of thousands of these tablets, and it's really slow to translate them. And then I have to like access them and all of that. But we have the step-by-step instructions, how you do this magical thing, how you do that magical thing. And when I first started writing, I thought, okay, we'll describe these things. And then I thought, wait a minute, this would be so much more engaging if what she thinks can happen can. She thinks this, they have a fascination with curses that the leader, the queen, would, if she wasn't bearing children, or she was always had a terrible cough, somebody had cursed her. And of course in fiction you can take a curse like that and make the stakes a little
Yeah.
higher as to what's happening. So and that's just much more fun. And the rules for my fantasy come straight out of Hittite tradition. Even things like I have her do some kind of mood influencing. She can, it's not mind reading or anything like that, but she can influence the way other people consider what they might choose to do. Well, in the Hittite corpus of rites, there are these procedures where, if, like, for example, a husband and wife were arguing and there was discord in the family, the principle was always harmony. You should keep the harmony in each stage of life, whether it's cosmic or family or whatever, every level. So she would go as the priestess and she would make this rite, and one of the steps of this very long rite was to make little tongues out of wax. You would spit on them out. You'd spit out the bad feelings and the bad words, and
Mm.
they'd get burnt up. This long, 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 long set of procedures. But that's the piece that I then actually put in my books. But that's a mood influencer, right? And she thought the gods were doing it. Well, I mean, if you think about family therapy, getting stuff out in the open and pushing them away and going on, all of that is psychologically brilliant, like we could all learn from the Hittites, but it also gave me room for some magic. So that was my thing. How fantasy came. And it's just so much more fun writing. And it's so much more fun reading. So you get all the history. It's the same world, all of my material culture, all of that. The big political events. I mean, I ended up writing epic fantasy because there was so much political intrigue and, usurping thrones and all that really fun stuff. Then that I don't break history there. There are often gaps and I have to fill them in. But all the big markers of this queen's life, I keep and I don't break them.
I love that you mentioned that for them, this wasn't fantasy, it was real. The gods are real, and they
Yeah.
have a vested interest in, say, their priests' well being because the priests can help them get more worshipers and so forth. And that's a great point to make. I love that. You mentioned, well, there's this thing I think about a lot when I'm meditating on what historical fiction is as a whole, and especially historical fantasy, what it is and verisimilitude. In other words, what can we get away with? And I remember this episode of Family Guy where I think it's Peter is climbing a tree. For whatever reason, he falls out. Spider-Man shows up out of nowhere, webs him so he doesn't fall and break his neck. And Spider-Man says, "Everybody gets one." And that always stuck with me. I thought, everybody gets one. And when I was writing, say, the first or second draft, I remember using like an action verb or something that's purely tech based, and you and I are writing in languages that never existed during this time. You're not even in a proto sense, really. And verisimilitude just kept popping up, and I thought, well, maybe everybody gets one. Maybe I get to use a certain word once, like liaison. That's French for bridge.
Right.
Okay, I'm trying to liaise with this person. I thought, okay, I can get away with it. And I think it's in this current draft I'm on. When we're talking about verisimilitude, what are your thoughts on that? Does everybody get one? Are you allowed? I know this is hyperbolic, but are you allowed to just say you're at the Library of Alexandria and you're going to Google this papyri or papyrus, this codex you're looking for? What are your thoughts on the everybody gets one kind of mentality?
I would say Google is going beyond it.
Yeah.
I'm currently working on a mythic retelling set roughly in sort of archaic Greek period. And the word ditch, like a kid ditches her teacher or,
Mm.
ditches her friends. And I have now defended it against two of my critique partners and I'm holding fast to it because it's tonally exactly. She is a teenager. She's not going to be for the whole book, but at this point, it's appropriate quality. And I think you have to have, when you are writing in English, representing an ancient language, you can't be anachronistic. And I know my copy editor, who's a pro at catching, like, oh, she caught the word switchback.
Mm.
It has a historical moment when it enters English. And it hadn't gotten caught in the book before. So I said, I don't want to go back into the old manuscript and like fix that and then republish. So let's just compromise on switchback. And there's one that I kind of would be okay with. But there's certainly words that are just don't feel ancient. But at the same time, you can't have everything stilted and funky sounding. I mean, that is still for me a hard thing to keep everything real feeling like you're really there. It is the way, and clearly people didn't speak in some stilted, ridiculous fashion. They just didn't. Like they spoke the way human beings do. So Yeah, it's always a juggling act. There's things like the verb steal, like to steal yourself.
Ah, I use
I
that one.
don't use that because I write in the Bronze Age. There is no such thing as steal. So there's one where I just think it will throw a reader out. And maybe that's the criteria.
Huh.
Like, ask yourself, would Google throw the reader out? And I think yes. And frankly, I think making a search through the Library of Alexandria, there's so much potential for either comedy or if you're being chased by somebody else and there's a time limit and
Mhm.
scrolls are not fun and easy to check. There's nothing quick. So I think that the dramatic potential of that scene, you just have to dig into and let Google go.
Doubts, obstacles, you're clearly learned in things antiquity and antiquity related or adjacent. And it's a lot of fun, by the way, just talking about these things. This has been cathartic, I'll put it that way. But despite the knowledge base, when it came to the actual writing of the thing, you said early on at the top of the show, you never really sought to become a writer. When you did start writing, what kinds of doubts started to arise?
Well, it wasn't even doubts. I knew it was terrible. Like, I just looked at my original, drafts and I thought, "This I know. I've taught literature for years, I know how to be a literary critic, and I can be a literary critic on this nonsense, and this is terrible. It's just not alive." So, I had to figure out how to do that, and it took me, I hate to admit it, but it was a good decade before I was really saying, "Oh, you know what? I might not write a first draft that's just right, but no one does, but I can get it eventually." And I think the key to that, because every time I sit down to write, every day, every time, it's like, oh, it's just like, it's the thing I love to do, but it's also the thing that takes you just it makes your brain hurt. It's
Mhm.
hard. It's just never easy. And I think that for me, I just say it does not matter. Just get 1,000 words or so down for the day, and they can be all bad words. I always tell myself they don't have to be good words. You can write 1,000 really, really bad words, and then you can quit today. And of course, when you think you're writing really bad words, that's usually when I've really nailed it. And when I think everything's going along swimmingly, and then I look at it later and I go, "Oh, I was in Judith land and not in the land of my characters, and I was disconnected, and this isn't very good. So, we'll just delete those and start back." So I think being willing to just write and not worry about quality is probably the best way to get quality onto the page.
You mentioned this background in literature, and obviously there's a history background there in writing. Did you find, say, I guess, like the scholarly rigor? Did you find it getting in the way of your writing? Because with my degree in anthropology, oftentimes I'll go through things and I'll hear this one professor, Dr. Reiser. My God, I will hear his voice in my head saying, because I'll use it periodically and not the common or proper noun it's meant to represent. And Dr. Reiser will go, "What is it? What is it, Sam?" Again and again. Do you ever find that sort of academic underpinning getting in the way of creativity?
Uh, I just find the two styles of writing so separate. I did find I when I started writing, I had a very Latinate style. So, or even more an ancient Greek style. Those long periodic sentences that just wind around, and you can hold off the verb to the very end. And I wrote like that. I wrote big, complicated sentences, and I did have to train myself when I have a really long, complicated sentence to make it very clear and very simple and lyrical, and the sound of it, the cadence of it pulls the reader through it. But to only have those on occasion when they really merit it, and the rest of the time to write a much more straightforward, direct style. But I think knowing, like, as a classicist, I had studied all the rhetorical devices and all, and, it sounds ridiculous to say, well, this is a moment you've hit a scene where, like, this is emotionally a super intense moment. A character has just lost their beloved or something. How do you make that work? And a lot of times it's those wonderful classically defined rhetorical devices. You slide those in, you use a bit of alliteration to, lull the reader into a sense of security, and then you switch the tone or the sound of the just purely on the rhythm and the sound, you can startle them and terrify them. And so a lot of all those metonymy, all those funny words that are just academic nonsense, but they also represent things you can do with language that are really cool. And I have to say, I use them all. Not, you will not see it in every chapter, nor will you see it on any page, on any given page. But when I want to really give that moment the beats that it really needs. Because I find that's now that I've written a lot and I am comfortable with who I am as a writer. I find that one of the little things that I no longer have to do on the fourth or fifth draft, but can do even as I'm writing a scene. I'll go, oh, wait a minute. I just got done with that a little too fast. Like this is the moment that needs, like the reader needs time to accustom themselves to this and to feel it and to let it resonate. And how can I do that without slowing it down, keeping that heightened emotion? And so cool to be able to use those tricks.
I was thinking of when you mentioned those longer drawn out prose and rhetorical devices, I was thinking of Nestor speaking to Achilles after the
Yes.
death of Patroclus and stuff. And yeah, everybody always goes, "Oh God,
Just
how
shut up,
many?
old man.
Please just shut up." We get it. But there's something to it because that speech still sticks with me. Even the first time I read it was in 2009, maybe. And I'm sure you probably know it by verse at this point. What Because even though it is pretty drawn out and most of those prose do, oh my God, they meander and it's just nothing but semicolons getting to the point, which I love semicolons. So maybe that's not, not the one I wanted to bring up. What is it about this ancient literature though that postmodern writers can learn from? Because let's stick with the Iliad. We mentioned Nestor, but obviously there's so much there that we can pull from Homer's epic. I personally have drawn inspiration with the action. I read a lot of action with the combat we mentioned and how there's a tragedy to it. It's a beautiful tragedy, and how, like you also mentioned, it's quite grim. It's visceral. People being stabbed through the eye and brain matter coming out the other side, hanging on the spear tip. It's incredibly visceral. But what is it that, if we want to use the Iliad, we could use the Odyssey if we're going to, kind of leapfrog from one to the next. What is it about classical literature, say the Iliad, for example, that modern writers, they should read this thing? Why should they read it? Because I'm of the opinion they should. Obviously, if you are as well, I'd be really interested to hear, why should postmodern readers read ancient classics?
Well, I think they would. I don't think that the Iliad sounds, I mean, providing either because one reads it in ancient Greek or there have been some wonderful translations recently. When you read it in a good translation, so it's a contemporary, you're actually apples to apples as opposed, because the ancient Greek, Homeric Greek is not highfalutin. It's not, I mean, if we're talking Cicero, in the Latin tradition, or
Yeah.
somebody like that, or Nestor's speech, which is made to sound oopy oopy because that's his character, right? But really, the Homeric Greek is extremely, the word visceral is a good one. I mean, when he's describing a fight scene, I also, I'm not a warrior. I don't know how to do that. So I knew what the weaponry was. I had those tools, but then how do you actually block a fight scene? I just went to Homer because they're great. You can't get better than that. But he also has that, to me, what raises him above a lot of fiction is that while there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of that very gritty material, there's also, well, I'll just take one moment. Towards the end of the Iliad, Achilles has now killed 50 sons, something like, 48 or whatever of the enemy.
Priam's.
Priam's, Priam is an old king, and he's lost unbelievable numbers of children to this man. And he just comes to get the body of the best of all of his
Of
sons. There's
Hector.
favoritism there. And he has to go and ask this man. And when I say, I said earlier, I see Achilles as a different kind of, a more,
Demigod.
well, he is a demigod in a way, but he's also incredibly human.
Hmm.
Like, and he has a real sense of depth of what that means. So when, he's been crazed and dragging this body around because he's mourning his friend, and that's all he can think about. So he's blind to everything else because this one emotion is driving him. That in itself is like a masterclass in what the process of grief is and what crazy things it can make you do. So there's another example. But then when Priam comes to him and, kisses his hand, and, it's like this whole humiliating thing, grotesque thing for this old man to have to do. Achilles just says, I see you and I see my own father.
Hmm.
When I can write something and I feel that kind of emotional realness, quick, it doesn't, it's not like highfalutin or going on and on. It's
Less than 10 words. It's
Yeah.
laconic.
That's so I don't know why. I mean, I think sometimes people think of the Iliad through these sort of older translations, so the language is very inaccessible English. It's just not any fun to read. Read the new ones.
So you started. You knew right away that perhaps these weren't the pristine, perfect prose you were looking for quite yet.
No.
As as far as setbacks, and this first one, as we're looking at your preface, I love because I really want to go into this. What kinds of setbacks presented themselves for you, Judith?
Well, I have always been a slow writer. I actually tricked myself into writing the first bit of Hand of Fire. I was taking Hebrew and I wrote a like overall story. It was probably like a 10-page essay or little story of the entire novel in Hebrew. Just getting sentences down was all that took. So that was a very freeing kind of way of getting started and just saying, here, doesn't matter. Look at me. I can write, in complex Hebrew. But that doesn't get you very far because I could not write a novel in Hebrew. So I just keep on working at it. And I had a really good critique group of friends, really almost like 8 or 9 years. We all gathered together every week around one of my friends' kitchen tables and helped each other through. And we were all beginners, which is a really good way to start out. You think you'd want somebody who could actually guide you, but no, you will drive that person crazy in your idiocy. But we didn't drive each other crazy because we were all idiots together. And one was an actress and I was a historian. Like everybody brought to the table things that were helpful. I had to relearn from my actress friend, I didn't need to block every single, state, but I did have to do exactly what she said and think it every step through so I didn't leave a prop behind or a this or a that. So we taught each other and we're kind to each other in the process. So I think that matters a lot.
That's wonderful. I love hearing that. The blocking thing gets me all the time. I had that. I write some darker stuff because it's Antiquity. It's hard not to. A character finds a mass grave and tries to pull a body out to find some clothing for someone and just takes the hand. And I realized I didn't address it. So for the rest of the chapter, that guy's just walking around with a severed hand. And I was like, well, this has been an issue here, Sam. Um, but also, I started a writers group and it was all newbies, myself included, only like 2 or 3 years worth of writing experience. It was a treat. I loved it. I highly recommend it. Anyway, what is the virtue in writing slowly? Because you and I are of the same mind here, whether it's because of we just can't or because we prefer or some synthesis of the two. I talk with a lot of people on this show who are prolific by any metric, really, whether it's yearly, quarterly, weekly. They write quite a bit and they publish quite a bit. Maybe it's more important to state. But I have to wonder, and I know from personal experience, I've benefited in various ways, but I have to wonder what your thoughts are on this, which is, are there virtues to writing slowly? People say slow and steady wins the race. I've heard people say fast and steady wins the race as well. But is there something to slow and steady that maybe people are starting to, pardon the pun, outpace in the self published market we now inhabit?
Well, a lot of my friends who write fast zip through a draft, and I keep circling back. I work from a rough outline. It gets more and more specific as I go along, but kind of behind me, and I start describing what I've done in a way that I can graphically see really easily, so I can have the whole book in my head. Um, but that means that when a character decides that I didn't have the right idea about them and they want to do something that I didn't anticipate, it just comes out on the page and there it is. And you're like, well, that is the right thing. The reason that came out on the page is because that's the truth. And now I've got to go back. I go back and I fix those things. I don't just keep barreling on and leave a note. I mean, if it's something small, I might just leave it and fix it later, but I really have to feel like what's behind me is going to stand and will keep supporting me as I keep moving forward. I also think, I mean, I'll spend a long time on individual words or trying a sentence a lot of different ways, even when I'm drafting, just rough drafting. And I think that shows. I mean, people say, "Oh, your language is gorgeous,"
Hmm.
and I just get lost in it. And I think that's because I listen to what I'm doing and I take the time to I mean, there's a difference between poetry and prose, and I'm definitely not writing poetry. I don't know how to write poetry particularly, but that care with individual pieces and the sound of language and the emotional resonance of language, all of those things, they don't come, at least not to me, fast.
Hmm. Is there such a thing as prose that are too purple? Is it kind of like we were talking about with verisimilitude? Is it more context dependent? Where is that line between more traditional contemporaneous prose and what we might say is purple that could be associated with more classical literature, or even if it's postmodern prose? Is there such a thing as too much purple?
I think there is. And I sometimes find myself straying into it. And then have to go back and fix. But yeah, you can get over drama queenie and, just like, ugh, too much. And I think a lot of sometimes there are very popular books that are really melodramatic. There's a kind of fun to that,
Hmm.
there's nothing wrong necessarily with it. Um, but I think it lifts you outside the real human experience. And I would rather with my fiction, I mean, I'm writing about a world that's really far away from the person who's reading it, but it shouldn't feel that way. And I don't think that purple prose helps close that, millennia gap.
Hmm. That's interesting. I usually hear kind of the connection people make through purple, but I could see also how it has that divorcing quality to that. So it's a really interesting flip side to that coin. Coming back to your preface here, I notice hardships having to do with presses, but also ended up working with an agent. Tell us about that. What is the value of a literary agent? Because a lot of people are under the impression submit it to everybody and just see what happens. What are the perks to an agent? Should people be looking for this? Is this the first step, or how do people go about this sort of thing?
Well, I ended up, my first book was traditionally published without an agent. And that was a small press that was up and coming and would have been great if the trajectory that it was on at the time that I was published kept on going. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, the person who owned the press decided that she didn't need all that staff after all, and things like that. That's just like that was what business model that made sense to her, and she did that, which was pretty devastating in terms of developing any kind of reach for it. That meant that that book went nowhere. It's done much better once I got my rights back and could promote it because it wasn't getting promoted. So one of the reasons to try out for an agent and from an agent to traditional publishing is because there is a kind of reach. If a traditional publishing houses decides to do that for you, like they don't for every book they publish, that's the sad and sorry news. They pick and choose which ones, why they pick you and publish you and then don't bother to promote you. I don't know. Like, they have some calculation that they've just decided, okay, well, we published that one, but it's not getting any of our time and effort. And I think sometimes that just happens through, your editor leaves and the person who's cheerleading your manuscript is gone. And so you get shoved in the corner. For me, when I actually got an agent, I already had one book out, as I say, with this small press, and I was looking for the next step. And I was teaching at a workshop, a really good writing conference in San Diego, the University of San Diego Writers Conference. And I was actually a presenter there, just doing that job. Like I love to teach writing. I do a lot of writing workshops and all that comes really naturally to me after my writing career. And I'd been mentoring, there are a bunch of people who were pitching to agents there. And I was coaching them on how to do that and all of that. And I had pitched to a bunch of agents, pay an extra fee and you can do it. And even though I was on the faculty, I was pitching to agents. So we were all kind of in that modality. And at the end of this conference, like the last night, one of these writers that I was mentoring said, "Oh, here, you sit here," and just sort of plopped me into a chair, like steered me in. And I was just like, "Give me a glass of wine. I'm exhausted. My brain is so tired. I've been teaching all day and working with all these people." And I turned and looked and I thought, "Oh, they just sat me down next to the keynote speaker of this whole conference, who's like this legendary literary agent and all of that." And I, out of courtesy, because it's the end and we're all tired, and he's been doing the same amount of teaching and interacting that I had, so I didn't, introduce myself or anything, but he's a perfect gentleman. He's retired now, but Richard Curtis, and he said to me, "Oh, who are you? What do you write?" Like, asked all the like little feeder questions.
Yeah, he's switched on.
Yes, he just was a gentleman and was really nice about it. So I, of course, fed him all the elevator pitch stuff. You should never go to a conference without all of your elevator pitch material.
15 words or less.
No matter how dead your brain is, you can still shove those things out. And as soon as I said Hittites, he lit up. Now, this is not the expected response, right? And it turned out we also talked about Talmud, and there were a lot of ancient things that we ended up chatting about. And it was an extended conversation that traveled over like 3 different spaces that evening and that kind of thing. And so he represented me. And that was really fun. And he had a certain vision for my Hittite novel in the beginning. It was much more romance oriented, and we reworked that, and that was good. It brought a lot of dimensions. He didn't sell. Hittites are a hard sell. They're a really small niche. They don't. The Tudors have a market. 20th century, first half 20th century is like a huge market right now. So there are places where the big presses know that they can make money. And then there are places like me where they look at you and go, "Well, we really liked this manuscript. Like, this is great. And you write really well, but," and it took several permutations. And then I actually was rewriting it as fantasy. Like, I hadn't even called Richard and said, this is what I want to do. I was just doing it. And he had it out in a other version. And I had said, let's just hold off for a while. And so we were sort of on hold. And I get this email from him, if you wrote it as historical fantasy, I have some great places to take that. I said, we're on the same page. So in the end, I kept hearing each offer that came in. It just was so unenthusiastic about the small market. And I didn't want some press to own, I mean, they don't own, but if they have the first in a series about a queen, then all the other books, if they decide not to keep publishing and not to do anything and just kill you off. And it happened to be a year that I was going through cancer, and it was like, what is going to bring me joy in life? And what's going to bring me joy is writing about this queen and writing about this character in history and controlling it myself. And that's when I became indie published. And I have never regretted that. I really enjoy, but it's small. It's a small niche. They were totally right on that. Their hesitation was well founded. My Troy book does much better because there's been this whole renaissance in Troy books, and the lovely thing about writing is it's a non-competitive sport. If I write a Troy book and then Madeline Miller comes out with Song of Achilles, that just lifts me up in the,
Yeah.
floating sea. It's not like buying a refrigerator or a car. There's a limitation of how many of those you can need, but books, infinite.
Actualization. Judith, when did you realize you become the author you'd always wanted to be? You've been writing prior to fiction, you'd been writing for a while. Obviously, this is a different kind of work, but as a fiction writer, as a creator, and as a continuing educator, do you feel like you've reached that point where you're good where you are, or is that something you're still working toward?
Well, I do remember early on, I had one book out, and, that was a struggle. We talked about, and I worked trying to get an agent and all that. None of it was easy. And at that kind of stage, I remember saying to a really close friend of mine, well, when I have a shelf of books, then I'll feel like, this is the measure of I've come, I've come to of age, and this is like, who I really am. And I don't feel I now have a shelf of books, they're all thick, some of them, most of them. They take up a good shelf, solid shelf, and they're really good books. Like, I'm proud of what I have produced. They're not flawless by any means, but I don't think of that as the definition anymore. And I think with every single project that I start on, there's not like some static thing. It's the challenge that I get to face each time. I mean, right now I'm writing a very different book than this Hittite series that we've been chatting about, which is what I'm about to publish. You always publish a book while you're already into the next one. So there's this sort of schizophrenia in your head where you really just want to talk about what you're in the middle of writing, but there's this beloved child that is about to come out into the world and be published, which in this case is my novel, Flights of Treason. But each time is a new challenge. And partly this series, this is the fourth book in the series. And I brought this series to a close because I just personally wanted to do something a little different and keep it fresh for me as a writer. And so when I get bored, that's a bad sign. And I had never have gotten bored as a writer, but I don't want to get there.
What else interests you? Because we're already naming the next kid before we've even given birth to the first one. I have to imagine for me, it's World War II. I'm looking at the battle in Berlin right at the end. I like when wars are about to end and sieges for whatever reason. So I'm already looking at 1945, even though I haven't finished writing about 146 BCE. A bit of a disparity in terms of time. What's on the horizon? Because I have to imagine if it's not having to do with the Hittites, there's something else on the back burner. What is it?
Well, I am working right now. I mean, the book that I chose to work on, there is a mythic retelling. What's a mythic retelling, you might ask? taking a Greek myth, and there have been a whole lot of really wonderful novels like this. I mean, taking a Greek myth. So I will use the example of Natalie Haynes's Stone Blind, which is, I think, maybe the best of all of the ones that have come out. It's my personal favorite. And she takes Medusa, who's usually a monster. You know, she's the horrific thing, and she shows how that's a wrong understanding. The woman behind the snakes, in essence. And she does it with voice and a little snarkiness because she's a stand-up comedian as well. And so she gives, there's a kind of modern feel, even while you're in this ancient setting. There's a little bit of meta to it. So it transcends time, even while it's in a time. And that is a really interesting balance to work in, but it's also really freeing. So I think when we were talking about words that, you know, how you write in the language, and I was saying the word ditch. So I am really comfortable. I would not have used a slangy word like that in my Hittite series, but I can here because there's this sort of floating quality, even while the palace that she's living in and all of that is very much the material culture that I know. It's ancient, you know, Mycenaean, Hittite milieu. There's a lot of borrowing across there. So that's really fun. And that's a whole new set of challenges. And in my case, I'm taking because I have a Troy book, and I thought, well, let me see if I can take another Trojan legend, Trojan myth, and try and create a little synergy with the two books. There's a episode in Achilles' life much earlier, and when his mother hides him because his mother is an immortal and she knows he is going to be a hero in the Trojan War and die. She is single-mindedly going to stop him from dying. It's like the really bad strategy as a mother, which is part of what this book is about. You shouldn't get too single-minded, and you should listen to who your kid is one element. But in the process of getting hidden by his mother, she dresses him up like a girl and sticks him in a harem. And of course, you know, there's a princess there. She gets pregnant. She has a baby. That baby goes off to Troy much later as an adult, right? There's a whole story there, like Briseis' story, Zippo, about this woman.
Hmm.
And so it's a novel about her. But in the process, it's also a novel about Achilles. And I have to say, I will not spoil this well, maybe I will. When I first started, the very, very first, like, sit down to start writing, and this is part of where it's so much fun to be an advanced writer, like a person who really knows. I know when something's going well, and I know how to kind of make that happen. The very first thing out pops, well, she does not dress him up like a girl. She makes him a girl.
Hmm.
And for a while, and that's not who he is, right? Like I just know, and I know, having lived a life as a mother and all of that, like, to me, all kinds of wonderful things started happening with a plot there and with characters. And here is a character with male vision of how to live a life in conjunction with this you know, young woman who's the princess who had nothing in the myth, no character, no nothing, modeling for her as a woman, but she's this has got a male vision. So there's like a way of opening up, a way of seeing. We talk about positive role models, and well, we should have women in high positions as positive role models. Well, in essence, what Thetis unwittingly does is throw a positive role model into this little court, but also throws a very fractured, discordant son into a situation. I mean, we know so much now about the whole trans experience. And in essence, she turns her son into a trans person. And so lots of fun and interesting. Sounds a lot of contemporary kinds of ways of seeing things
Mm-hmm.
that are coming out of myth. and these bizarre episodes that myth presents us with. And they get a really profoundly human things, and they present them in such a quirky, weird way that we see much more about humanity. So that, I think, is what a mythic retelling is. And lately they have tended to be fairly feminist in orientation, which mine is, and that was true of my Troy books, Hand of Fire. So, that matched with my sensibility anyway. So that's what I'm working on now, but it's very different from my Hittite series.
Without spoiling anything, looking at your preface, you mentioned the difficulty of writing battles and combat.
Yes.
Yes.
And the book that I really should be pushing in this whole, I mean, my reason for reaching out to you to do a podcast. Oh, this is delightful and joyful. If I had known who you were, I would have called you no matter what a long time
Thank you.
ago. But I'm actually promoting the fourth and final of this series called Flights of Treason, and the piece for me that just stumped me is at the end of this book there is a huge battle, which doesn't give anything away, but it's a battle that takes place on so many levels, and I had to get them all written, and I had to keep the geography of this really widespread battle. So in the beginning of the battle, there's a huge engineering problem. It's siege warfare,
Hmm.
ancient siege warfare, which theoretically I know nothing about. I mean, I do, but I don't really. Like, I've never tried to besiege a city. I have never tried to, undermine walls or anything like that, or get over them. And so there was this whole engineering part, and there was a character. My Hittite books all they have a plot that is the Tesha, the queen. Her sister is blind, and is incredibly intelligent, and uses echolocation, which is not what they called it, but she gets around really well. So
Hmm.
she's an incredibly capable person. I have to say that every blind person who's ever enjoyed my books is like, yes, you have done this. I'm very proud of my because obviously I am not blind, and it was a learning process.
I like that. I'm visually impaired. I'm partially blind, and there's
Oh,
actually,
are you?
yeah, there's a gentleman in Australia. He uses clicks, and he can ride a bike because he's been able to master that.
No, I read all about this. I was like, oh, I can do this.
Mhm.
We can I can use this. She actually becomes a spy, and she finds it hilariously funny that, of course, everyone discounts her
Yeah.
because she's blind, and she says vision is the least useful sense, because it's so simple and you don't really pay attention, right? So she can dupe sighted people so easily. So there's that character, and the person that she is romantically attached to, and they have a part of this battle, which is very engineering and physical, and it's like what we think of a siege. And then, of course, there are swords and javelins. I mean, there's like spears and all of that,
Yeah.
right? And armor. But then there are two sorcerers, one on one side. We're borrowing from Egyptian mythology on one side, Hittite mythology on the other,
Magical
and
artillery.
mashing up. And that has to escalate and escalate and escalate. And because they in Hittite iconography, there are all these griffins, these big lion creatures with wings and eagle heads. There's almost no mythology about griffins. So once again, I get to do whatever I want. And all of my Hittitology, archaeology friends said, "Ooh, you got to make them come alive. They have to be characters." And this is the people who dig in the dirt about this, like they have all the skin in that you could possibly want. So I was like, okay. So my novels, not the first one, because this is I plant the seed in the first series, but and then by the second book, the Griffins enter in full fledged. There's a small version in the first one, but there's a whole Griffin realm plot line also. So the battle also has an element of griffin in it, that comes, and they're huge. They're like house size, building size. They're really giant. So they're kind of the nuclear weapon of my plots, because if they come in, so I had to think of a way of creating this whole battle so that they, even if they did enter, they did not. It wasn't simple. They weren't. They couldn't be the easy solution to it all.
Right.
Um, so I had to write all of that. It was incredibly hard, but incredibly fun. It took me weeks. I don't know. This is, we talked about slow writing. I just, I write a little piece, and then oh wait, if that's going on, then this, and and juggling it and smoothing the consistency out and all of that stuff. And I have to say, everybody who's read it, it's like, oh, this is the best thing you've ever written. This is like such a great ending. So yay for me.
Yeah, I've got multiple chapters in the current novel that are large scale conflicts as well. The last one in particular is, like you're saying, it has to be German engineered. This thing can't be missing a single gear. It all has to be timed perfectly. And I think a lot of people see action in novels and think, oh, that's just like, oh, he hits them. Oh, she throws a fireball. Whatever. No, I mean, I argue that it's actually a very nuanced form of conversation. It's a dance. You talk to martial artists, and they'll always tell you that martial arts is a dance, and there's a give and a take to it. And sometimes you dance fast, and sometimes it's slow and pensive. But I love writing it. I actually think it has made me a much better writer because, like we were saying, blocking and logistics, the engineering of it, whether we're talking about engineering the prose or the actual siege engines, all that kind of stuff. It's an excellent way to train yourself to always in the back of your head say, don't forget, do not
Yeah.
forget. And also in 2.5 minutes, actually 2 minutes, 37 seconds, point five, those griffins need to show up. And if they don't, then you got to go back 3 chapters and fix it so they leave later than you originally have them.
Yeah, I think the whole planting the seed so that something much later can happen in an organic, expected, a way that doesn't go, wait, you just pulled that. That's Deus ex machina. That's, like just coming out of left field. That is something that was a hard-earned skill. And I have fun. I mean, now on this current manuscript, I'm like, oh, ho, 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 look at me. I know to put here, and it makes sense in this scene. It's got everything going for it right here. It has a purpose. But oh boy, its real purpose is way far down the manuscript road. And I love being able to, that's part of the fun of feeling like I've come of age as a writer, that I know the tools. And it doesn't make them easy to use, but I know them. And I didn't used to know them.
New World, a lot going on as far as leading up to this point, but all of it good and really exciting. People haven't been able to see me, but I have been grinning ear to ear this entire conversation. Curious to hear from you, Judith. How are you a different writer today? I mean, you still have this academic classicist background that has continually contributed to your fiction work. Have you changed in how you look at antiquity? Have you changed in how you tell historical fiction over the numerous books you've written? How are you different as a person, as an author today versus when you first set out?
Well, I think I have a livelier sense of how to represent the past. So I remember a memorable, every time I would get a rejection from an agent, and I have hundreds of those. Well, I don't literally anymore. I've long since deleted them, but each time I would get one, I would write them and say, could you, in a sentence, tell me what was wrong? Right? What would you change? Because if you give them just a really small thing, and this is part of my advice to writers, if you're going to try for an agent, you're going to get a lot of rejections. Milk it. You will only get anything back from, a tiny percentage of them, because most of them don't even say no. They don't say anything. And if they do say no, then the even smaller number. But for those few who are actually decent human beings and get back to you. So this one, she wrote back, dialogue stiff, 2 words. That was her answer. And I went, oh. okay, well, I'll take this seriously. And I did, and I carefully read a whole series of books set in the ancient world and looked at how they dealt with dialogue. And I did this whole literary critical academic. We talked about, okay, that's my background. So I did an analytical look at dialogue. And then I had to, like, okay, now I have to do that, right? That's a whole different process. And I think now I have to laugh. My husband often says, "Oh, I hear you in this dialogue." And it's like, that is not what I'm aiming for. Like,
Don't tell
dear
me that.
husband, don't say that, like this is, but so no. So apparently not perfect, because no, I'm not writing Judith Starkston in the Hittite world. Um, but on the other hand, I have gotten away from this stiff, like how do you portray a slave versus a king or queen or whatever? Like, how do you represent language? You're working in English, not in Luwian, not in Hittite, not in any ancient language. You're working in this completely foreign medium. And so I frankly, I use all of my grammar. I know grammar so well as who I am. And I just pick, all right, well, what kinds of mistakes would this person make on a semi-consistent, not entirely consistent, but sort of that would mark their, educational back. There's no education going on here. And then you'd be amazed at how many things you can put into English that then you sound like you have an Irish character. I don't know why, but I think it's just all the bad trying to represent dialect, Irish dialect. Yeah, you have to avoid certain things. So I've just played around with that enough now that I think I have a feel. And that's probably was one of my bigger. The agent was right. She gave me great advice. It was only 2 words of it, and I think being willing to listen to criticism and put it into action, and you get better and better at putting it into action. And nowadays, I really feel like, oh, you can level almost any criticism at me, and I will just stop and listen and go, oh, okay, I'll go back. I'll do that. I mean, once in a while, somebody says something, and it's like, no, you're just wrong. And that's not all very often, though. And the people that I really lean on and trust to give me critique, typically, they're not going to say something goofy. So,
Do you ever look at a 1-star review and with that same mentality, you just think to yourself, okay, this might be rough, but I'm going to see what they have to say? Assuming you have any. I don't know if that's the case.
I do have some. Yeah, ironically, my first in series Priestess of Ashana, which you have to get the most reviews in the marketing world. It's your first in series that sells it's the flagship of the entire project. And so at one point there's like myths about how many reviews you need to have for Amazon to give you some love, et cetera, et cetera. So there are services, you're not buying reviews, but you buy access to their big group of reviewers, and they put your book there and people can choose to review it, and you pay to be in that pool. It's just access to people who are willing to write reviews. Nowadays, it's just the people who read my books who review it, and that's lovely. But I got so many bad reviews from that, like they hated my stuff. And it was like, what?
They just didn't appreciate ancient history. Let's just assume
Yes.
that's it.
Well, and they kept saying, she doesn't know anything about this. This is not the way the ancient world, or this is not how this person would be. And it's like, well,
Actually, here's a
actually,
codex from 3,000 years ago that says, yeah,
on the clay tablet, number whatever,
yeah.
translated by so and so, this is exactly. So yes, there are people who they think they know, and that's fine. I'm sure that they have some well-earned knowledge about the ancient world that they have worked on and they believe in, and great for them. They came to the book with an idea, and my idea was different, and that's fine. I guess the other thing, I'm super organized about my plots now. I mean, they surprise me constantly. and change direction and all, but partly because I write these lots of layers of plot and they're all going and they have to keep up, you have to switch. I'll have 3 points of view characters, and so you have to keep inserting. It's not absolutely regular, but
Would you say that a historical fiction writer is legally required to outline? Because I'm kind of that opinion.
no, because I know several people who just don't, and they do a good job.
Those are brave souls. I don't know how you do that.
Well, and they tend to write shorter
Okay.
books. The sort of large epic scale of book, I don't know how you could no clue how you do that. And maybe you would write it and then you would have to go back and outline what you had and then reorganize the whole thing.
That just sounds like extra work to me.
Yeah, it just would be such a burden.
I know I personally have already gotten a ton from this conversation, and I'm going to be bugging you once the mic goes cold about more stuff. But as far as people listening who want to hear even more from you, and they do because you've got a lot of good stuff here, seminal books, classes, seminars, speeches, books from 1,000, 2,000 years ago, ones written 2 years ago, advice for aspiring writers, Judith.
Well, there's always reading the Iliad in a nice, good translation. But in terms of writing practical advice, I would say books that I used, and I don't use a lot of writing books. I have a ton, and I tend to have them sit on my shelf, and I don't read them until I have to teach a session. And I'm like, let me see what so and so thinks, and then I incorporate. So I guess my best way to learn how to write is to teach how to write.
That's when you know you're talking to someone who's a teacher. It's the best way to learn is to teach. I love that. Sorry to interrupt, but I love hearing that.
My if you're writing a big book, or something like we talked about historical fiction needing a coherent plot, organizational principle. The book that I use is written by Alexandra Sokoloff, and it's called Screenwriting Tricks for Authors. It is her whole book is she uses movies, not books, as her sort of demonstrating principles because everybody has seen them. So it's a kind of common way. It's not screenwriting for screenwriting.
Right.
It's screenwriting for books. And I have to say I found that occasionally mildly annoying just cuz I wanted to think about fiction. But she has this really clear, straightforward way of keeping your pacing up the whole time. It's the 3 act. I mean, it's not, there's nothing radical here. It's 3 act structure, which is really 4 acts because you divide the second act into 2 pieces. When non-writers hear me talk about how I plot my books, it sounds super formulaic, but it's like you can take any book that's really good and lay it out. I call it boarding it. I get those three-sided boards, that science projects are on, and a whole lot of Post-its. And in my case, I have different colored Post-its for each point of view. So whichever point of view a chapter is in, and I lay them out. And for me, it allows me to see, okay, I can have some workaday chapters, but I need something big and climactic soon. So maybe I need to rethink how this is structured. And I need to dump my characters into the worst of the worst around about somewhere here. If you look at every story everybody's ever told, it follows a certain structure, even though the plots are completely different. The content is completely different. There's nothing formulaic about it. It's just a rhythm to the way stories feel. There has to be a beginning that gradually rises and you kind of get a solution, and that you don't have to learn anything new because you're going to get it. And then no, you are going to have to learn everything new, and you are going to have to figure out a whole new way of new people and new horizons, and then you climb up there and even that doesn't work. I mean, that rhythm is just listen to the dumbest story that someone's telling over beers and it'll have that structure,
Yeah.
like, so that's a nice book where that innate human need for story gets really systematized, and you can take a good buddy and say, all right, let's board my book. Let's just like put it out into her structure. And I promise you a good bottle of wine if you'll just stay with me and keep telling me, no, I'm bored here. I'm bored. Okay, no. There's bored and boarding it. Two different words that I think about. So there's that book. The other book that I use for plotting is Libby Hawker's Take Off Your Pants. The joke, of course, is there are pantsers, people who write by the seat of their pants versus plotters, outliners. And hers is a really quick little book, and the whole plot angle is driven by the character's arc, like the change. Who your character is in the beginning is different than who they are at the end. What's that arc? And that's a really good antidote. Is that the word I want?
Anecdote.
Oh, no, it's a
Oh,
good
antidote.
balance.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Antidote.
Yeah.
A good balance to the very structural way that Alexandra Sokolov's screenwriting technique is. I use both and they kind of go back and forth, and I don't really use either entirely, but those are my two sort of compelling ways of doing it. I kind of start with Libby Hawker's character arc because if that's not there, then your book will no reader will get through it. And then as I'm actually trying to juggle all these different plot lines and character things, then I keep the pacing up with hers. The other book that I really like is Lisa Cron's Cron, Wired for Story, which is also a lot about character, about psychologically what your reader is going to need to hear and what processes your character needs to go through in order to hook into those primal, the way we think. She's also the one who taught me how to build a plant organically and then have the payoff for the plant way down the road. She's the master of that.
Those are a lot of fun. I feel a little bit manipulative doing those, but
Oh, but they're so satisfying as a reader.
yeah.
I mean, you're so like, "Oh!" But if it's stuck in at the beginning and it doesn't have a reason, then no one pays attention to it, so there's no payoff.
Yeah, that sense of intrigue that needs to be conjoined there is for me, because I've got, I'd say, two things early on that you won't get any explanation for hundreds of pages. And
Yeah.
the trick there is to periodically find ways to weave it back into the narrative that's organic. And that takes a lot of work because I'll look at it in post or coming to it at the next draft and think, that's just like, that is shoehorned in there, dude. What were you thinking? That probably sounded great to you when you were writing that. But that is a lot of fun. And I think there's, with foreshadowing, with planting, breadcrumbs, all these things we can use to describe the idea of the twist or that kind of penultimate moment being fully realized without feeling arbitrary or artificial. That is a lot of fun. And I think like those all sound like really great texts to go with. We talked about it a little bit with your academic background, things like that. Essential habits. What kinds of things do you encourage writers practice as regularly as they can, especially considering how busy and easy it is to occupy our time nowadays?
Yeah. I think you need to write pretty regularly, and what the definition of that is fits different people's lives. I mean, I have the luxury now of not being a teacher anymore.
Oh, I'm
So
so jealous.
yeah, I suppose I could have been writing when I was teaching, but it would have been really hard. So I have the luxury of lots of time, and I can put my writing in the time when my brain is going to be freshest and most alive. But whatever your constrictions of time, identify the time and then say, okay, if that's all I've got, what is a word count that will match that time in a way that I can actually achieve? I'm not like setting some ridiculous goal because it's nurturing to say, okay, I'm going to do 500 words or 200 words or whatever it is. You get it done and you don't have to go off and wake up the kids or whatever it is. You actually got it done. That's good. So give yourself a realistic goal, create a structure in your life when you can do that, and stick to that. I think being open to criticism, we talked about that before. being able to hear that something's not working, that it's not done well, it's not, don't get defensive. If all you can muster in response is silence, that's fine. I know the first few times when I was had developmental edits done of my works, and I actually hired that out. I don't, that's a stage I do differently now, but like the first edit I got was chop off this first 7 chapters. And my immediate reaction to that letter was, "No! Do you know how many agents said they wanted to read manuscript based on those first few chapters? Why would I cut those? Those are the one tried and true." She was absolutely right.
Hmm.
I gave myself a couple days to calm down and put that file in the permanent, like kept it, opened a new one, took the novel, chopped off the first 7, said, "Okay, now how do I start this book?" And did it. And yes, it was good. So always be open to that. And words are infinitely changeable. You're not building a building. If you lay a foundation of a building one way, you're stuck with that. But that's not true. Every word can be changed. Everything about your book can be changed. Just know that. And no, that's not meaning the whole thing is garbage. It just needs this change.
What's the value of the writers group? Because I always get a different response, and it's half the reason I ask the question. But what's the value of a writers group? Why should people who aren't part of one go looking?
I cannot imagine having written books without my various villages. It's sort of that cliched idea. And I think earlier I described these 3 women, the 3 of us around a kitchen table with a similar kind of moment in life where we were. So there was comfort and there was support. That's just flat out cheerleading, is really helpful. These days, I really look forward to hearing early on. I have a critique group that now I meet with out online because I've moved states, and during COVID, we all started online anyway, so we just kept up with it because we'd had some geographical diversity put into our lives. And I very carefully created a critique group when I moved to Davis. Like, I actively sought that out. It's not easy to do. You have to find people who are at similar stages and can actually give you feedback. And there are some really jerky people in the world. I've heard a lot of stories of writers who go, "Oh, I could never do a critique group again. This person was said these horrible things to me and they put me down." And that's their toxicity. Of course, don't go to that critique group. You don't need to be dumped on. I will say that my husband will say, "Boy, you guys were really ripping each other apart." It's like, no, 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 no. We weren't
Uh,
ripping each other apart. I had left out all the violence that needed to be in this scene. They were just pointing that out to me, and he'll go, "Oh, you were totally fine with that." I was like, "Yeah, I've been working with these people for 10 years. They know what I want to hear." And so you develop a trust and rapport. I do recommend before you start a critique group with somebody or make a lot of emotional involvement, you say, "Oh, let's exchange a chapter. Read their chapter.
mm,
Do you like what they write? Even more important, do you have something useful to say to that person?" A friend will say, "Oh, can you read manuscript for me?" Or can you, and I'll read it and I'll go, "Well, yeah, I, I don't know why. I'm a really good editor, but I haven't got very little to say on this. And it's not because I think it's all perfect. Like, I just don't know. I don't bring to the table for this manuscript." So pick people for whom, and for me, it has nothing to do with genre. Like, I'm as happy to critique, a contemporary thriller as I am historical. My partners are all different across the whole genre fix. So it isn't that. But you have to find soulmates. You have to give yourself room to like feel them out, exchange chapters, see what they say about your work. Do you like what they write? If not, go on to somebody else. I think going to writers' organizations like Sisters in Crime, which is for men too, the Historical Novel Society has local chapters. There are lots and lots of writer organizations. Here, there's the California Writers Club. There are all kinds of different things. They're all really good. And one of the things they give you is a group of writers that you can get together with. when you're socializing, you realize, oh, I like this person. That's the person to say, oh, do you want to trade chapter? It's just a chapter. Let's see how we like each other as writers.
Also a great reason to go to panels and write workshops,
Exactly.
all that
Go
stuff.
to go to, there are all kinds of writer workshops, all those things. Go to those. The people sitting around you taking the workshop, listen to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I always look for the person who's taking pretty good notes. Though some
Uh-huh.
people are great, they just soak it up. Going back to the writers group, when we talk about how to discuss somebody's work if there's something in need of critiquing, I always said in the writers group I started, because I couldn't find anything dedicated to science fiction and fantasy, so I just started one. And that's a little aside for folks who are maybe struggling the same way I was, is that when critiquing somebody's work, I think it was always important, and I led with this. I had kind of a top three, set of rules. One of them was always have one in the chamber, air quotes there, because it's really easy to say this just doesn't work. That's so easy to say, but if you can articulate why it is, that does two things. One is it exercises your problem solving skills, your writing chops in general, and it helps your colleague. It's really easy to say, there's a lot of blocking issues. It's another thing to say, why don't you put a really large, just monumental piece of architecture in here? You've got this ancient setting, it's next to this ziggurat. Why don't you just have this beat up old column that stands out among all the rest and just establish proximity? Anyway, that's a little aside. I'm not in that writers group anymore, but there are a lot of holdovers from it in terms of lessons that I think, well, I know I still benefit from. I think maybe some other folks can too. This one's so different for everybody. Some people participate in this. Some people don't really have much stock in it. Physical, mental, mindfulness, those kinds of things. The overall health of a writer, is that important? What kinds of things do you do to facilitate good health?
Well, I think you have to get some exercise. And I find a lot of my best ideas come while I'm walking or riding my bike, or water seems to do it, showers.
I got one yesterday in the shower.
Yeah, I don't know, there's something freeing up, and I think when you're really stuck, instead of just sitting there staring at a screen, I am not a believer in waiting for the muse to strike, because the muses just say, "Screw you," when that's your attitude, but
Yeah, she's a fickle mistress.
and she loves to say, "Oh, you're not putting in the effort. Never mind, not coming to you." But a good way to put in the effort is to go for a walk or to do something, and just I think probably my neighbors think I'm a little crazy because I'll be talking out. Oh, wait, this is, and then I'll have to, get my phone out, and I have never figured out that like the note thing disappears. So I have the most Luddite way. I open my email and I just like put everything in an email and
Oh,
send it to myself because it will not get
that's
lost.
a great idea, though.
It's like
Yeah,
ridiculous.
I like that.
So, yeah. I also find that, I love to I do a lot of gardening, and that to me is very, again, it's a sort of Zen thing. I'm not thinking about anything because 'cause I'm thinking about, "Wait, how does this plant, what am I gonna prune off of this thing? Does this really belong?" Or is death coming to this little guy? All these, they are really inconsequential decisions, but they take my whole mind and they allow it to focus on that without overburdening or tiring me out. They rejuvenate me. So there's that. And I also find I enjoy shooting the breeze writer wise with fellow writers. And I think that is a really good mental health thing for writers. I, get together with coffee for, even in Davis. I've only been here a couple years, but they all found, eventually I found them. They are all organized because we're a small town here. And we get together and chat about just that it's not an easy profession. It's not lucrative. It's not mentally easy. You don't get a lot of respect. I mean, you need your colleagues to enjoy it with because they get it.
Yeah, you need your village. I understand.
Right.
Last thing, we talked about it a little bit with your agent. Sounds like a wonderful guy. It's too bad he's retired. I want to bug him. But overall, some advice on publishing, things that you found have been pretty useful, sagacious.
Well, I actually think having sent my manuscript out to so many agents and all of that, as long as you are actively seeking feedback in that process, and I described that earlier, my first version of Hand of Fire that went out was way too long. It just was. People had told me that. I didn't pay attention. The process of sending it out taught me, indeed, that is true. The really hard project of taking 50,000 words out of a book,
Ugh.
I can do that, and so I think it can really hone your skills. And if you look at it that way, okay, I'm going to give X amount of time. I am going to actively, every no I get will immediately get a super polite, really short, can you please tell me what to fix? That's probably not even the way I'd frame it. One or two things to improve, like just make it so easy that they just slam out those words and send them off to you. If that is the arc that you see yourself going through, then if you happen to get an agent, miracle of miracles, great. But also notice in my narrative, I got a great agent, super sympathetic, had a very good relationship with him. I did not sell a manuscript. And I know of lots and lots of people for whom that is also the case. So that holy grail of I will just get an agent and everything will come easily. And even if you get an agent and they sell your manuscript, and then you think, oh, now really I have come, everything will come easily now. Even then, I cannot tell you, I know of almost nobody who has not had a bad story with a publishing house. And then they either switch to a different publishing house or, they abandoned that series and started a new one. And, so know that if you're going to go traditional publishing and the whole agent, just know you are bringing yourself into the world of a lot of grief. And if you expect it and it's not a reflection of you, but just that's the industry, that's how it is, it's all about negativity and dumping, you better know that you are who you are and that you're worthwhile and that what you've written is worthwhile while being open to every edit that imaginable. Then that's probably a good project. I also think self-publishing is perfectly fine, providing that you are totally gonna get it properly edited and you're not gonna ignore it when somebody says this is 50,000 words too long. Like the fact that no one's gonna say, oh, I'm not gonna publish it because it's too long, does not mean that you should not do the work. You still have to do the work.
Judith, this has been awesome. I've had so much fun. We geeked out pretty hard there, and I regret none of it. If we lost listeners, I don't care. This was an absolute treat talking about the Hittites, the Trojans, Antiquity, just the Mediterranean basin, the Levant, Asia Minor. This is so much fun. Your advice, not only just looking at the traditional route, but indie, and then really emphasizing the importance of the writers group, all of that, and then what we can benefit from by examining the classics time and again, because we also have different interpretations over time. All of it has just been fantastic. It's been such a great conversation. I really appreciate it. So, Judith Starkston, thank you so much for sharing your preface with us today.
Well, thank you. It was great fun. I enjoyed myself immensely.
And there you have it, Judith Starkston's preface. Hope you enjoyed that as much as I obviously did. I couldn't help myself. Like I said, one for me, one for you. I think this is one for everybody, though. Cool conversation about Briseis. I've always found her character interesting, her treatment, not just in the Iliad itself, but how people in more contemporaneous works have portrayed her. I'm thinking about the Song of Achilles, which was mentioned in the show, and that is a great read. And then just the context of women in antiquity in general. Puduhepa, incredible woman, and just the autonomy she enjoyed within a world that was typically male dominated is really impressive. Really speaks to her gravitas, her strength of character. And just the conversation about why history matters throughout the conversation Judith and I had, just looking at why this stuff matters. It's not just that it repeats or that it rhymes. It helps us understand the human condition and can get us into a better position to experience empathy and that tends to be a net positive for society. So just looking at why history matters, and it doesn't matter what it is. And like I mentioned at the top of the show, Flights of Treason is out as of today. Plenty of places you can get that. Kindle. You can also go to Judith's website at www.judithstarkston.com to see other booksellers, all that good stuff. And she is on the Facebook, judy.starkston, Twitter, Judith Starkston, and Instagram, Judith_Starkston. And if you'd like to learn more about me, Sam Hale, Hale, at Gmail, Sam Hale, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I've got more tap outs planned. I got a big old list. Next one might have to do with Dungeons and Dragons. We'll see. I'm excited to start outlining that little chit chat and see where the muse and I go, where Athena takes me. So I've got some work ahead of me. I hope the muse is perched upon your shoulder, whispering nothing but inspiration in your ears. And until next time, stay humble, folks.